All right, let's get this kicked off today. TJ, thanks for jumping in and joining. I appreciate the conversation that we're about to have today. For everyone that's jumped in, really appreciate you making the time to learn. Today, we're here to talk about mastering the government software approval process in record time. How do you do that? What are the pieces, and what does that look like? I'm Joey. I'm one of the managing partners here at the Outpost side. We help companies grow and scale in the defense space. And today I brought one of my dear friends and fellow Coloradan, TJ, to jump in. He's here with Second Front Systems. They've done an amazing job transforming the software space and how companies can get accredited, how they can work on government systems. What the most amazing thing about TJ is how he took his time in the military and he took that understanding of what it means to serve the warfighter and then took that understanding to a place of, hey, I want to grow sales. I want to help companies be in this space. And now he's the chief revenue officer at Second Front Systems. And today we get the honor of just riffing for a little bit and chatting. So I'm super excited to dive into that here with you. And thank you all for making some time. And thanks all for jumping in to listen about what we're chatting about. If you have any questions, you want to jump in and ask a question yourself, please feel free to use the Q&A function. I'll use that to help moderate some of the discussion with TJ. And if there's something you want to dig into more, please let us know. This is meant to be a little bit of a open forum and discussion, and we'll go ahead and riff a little bit and have a little bit of fun.
Looking forward
TJ,
to it.
yeah, super excited to have you here. Next time we'll do this in person as we're both
Yes.
in Colorado today, so we'll make that happen. We were supposed to. I'm normally in DC, and we've like flew around each other today, but it didn't end up happening. So, um, TJ, tell me a little bit about the government stakeholder process and commercial software, right? Like it's people think, hey, I'm selling in the commercial space. I know selling to government's a little bit harder. Like what requirements are out there? What actually needs to happen?
Yeah. So, kind of 2 points on commercial software companies engaging with government stakeholders. The first being that I think this is probably a really exciting time to be a new entrant or a startup in this market. Like to be determined how this plays out over the next couple of years, but there's a ton of excitement in this industry, in this vertical. There's a ton of capital inflow, and there are probably more front doors to the department and the federal government than there have been in recent years. So AFWorks, DIU, industry days, CDAO, Tradewinds, organizations like the Outpost, there are so many great people and great Americans, both inside the government and outside the government, that are working hard to close kind of that commercial software product stakeholder gap. Um, Now, once you get through the front door, there's kind of another, larger go-to-market strategy that you have to have contemplated, but there's better connective tissue, I think, between the stakeholder and the commercial software product than we've seen in a long time. The second piece is I think we tend to treat the Department of Defense or maybe public sector writ large as this kind of monolithic, like esoteric organization that is blurry and it's hard to navigate, but it's really not dissimilar to selling to or engaging in any highly regulated industry. So if you're selling a software product commercially, maybe you are in highly regulated industry or not, but if you were to build kind of a go-to-market playbook in healthcare or financial services or critical infrastructure, it is really analogous to engaging with the Department of Defense and the federal government as well. So I think we tend to treat it a little bit differently because of the nuances, but there are a lot of parallels to those kind of go-to-market pathways and what sets commercial software companies up for success.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I wanted to ask a little bit more about your background, right? How did you get into this, and why? Why do you care about this?
Yeah, so I got into it totally by accident, and I entirely blame Peter Dixon and Enrique Odi and Tyler Sweat for pulling me in. But my personal background was an Army infantry officer for about 7 years. Had an amazing time in uniform, deployed a couple of times to Iraq and Afghanistan. Transitioned out of the Army about 4.5 years ago, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't know kind of what was out there. I had kind of two theses at the time. One was I wanted to get away from government and defense as an industry for a variety of reasons, but really just wanted something fresh, wanted a kind of a pure commercial experience. And I wanted to work in an industry that had not been fundamentally disrupted by tech the way so many industries have been so far. And for me, that was commercial real estate. So I was fortunate to join a team at Jones Lang LaSalle, a Fortune 200 commercial real estate brokerage firm, in their kind of newly founded technologies group. So they did a variety of things from corporate venture to corporate strategy and development to the software products that we had across the enterprise. But very quickly, I realized I wanted to be in a startup. I wanted to be an early stage operator. I knew that go to market was where I could lend my skills best to an early stage company. And as I was kind of figuring out what that meant for me and what product I wanted to go work for and grow, that's when I met Enrique and Tyler and the team. And they said, hey, we have this idea. We're going to build a platform and we're going to try to productize the majority of the ATO process to make this easier for the market and make it easier for SaaS to just transact and adopt and deploy in the Department of Defense. So kind of two things happened at that point. One, personally, it fit the exact kind of role and position that I was looking for in my career. And it fit the mission that I think is super important for all of us. We've all had experiences if you're in uniform or you're in the government where you didn't have the software tools that you wanted or you needed to do your job, and workflows are inefficient, or in some cases, even weapon systems or very critical tactical equipment is not to the par that it needs to be for our operators and our end users. So when I kind of looked at each of those in second front at the time, kind of pre-game warden, pre-product launch, it fit the mission, it fit the product, and it fit the people that I was looking for. And then I think on a more maybe macro level, it's no secret that accreditation, ATOs, is a systemic problem for the Department of Defense, not just for cloud hosted software and SaaS and what we kind of focus on as a company now, but for embedded weapon systems, software at the edge, a lot of different capabilities. This is a really big problem set. And so I think just having the opportunity to work with great people on a very hard problem to bring a technical solution to a systemic challenge. I mean, I think that's kind of like the early stage operator dream, honestly.
Yeah. And it sounds like you made that transition pretty well, right? From saying, like, hey, I want to be an operator to, hey, I want to actually enable people to bring the right software to the weapon systems and to the day-to-day warfighter. So
100%.
amazing to see you do that transition. And you're right, like the team at Second Front has the right culture, the right mindset, and are really driving that space forward. But for a lot of our listeners, they might, we talked a little bit earlier about the landscape and how there's a lot of different entry paths. Can you help me understand what does a startup normally have to do to get their software to be approved on government systems? And
Yeah.
I know I'm asking a big question here, right? Because when I say government systems, we can be talking about the federal civilian agencies, the DoD, and a few other places. So let's pick the DoD maybe to get started.
Yeah. And I'll touch on a little bit of those as well, because I think it's important, especially probably for the folks dialing in, of this can get very quickly nuanced or esoteric depending on which vertical of the public sector you're looking at accreditation for. But it comes down to two pathways. It is your contracting pathway and your infrastructure or customer network pathway. I think those are the two critical pillars that, as a startup, you need to assess and have a good picture of very early on. So the first piece, like, it goes back to your ideal customer profile. Who is your ICP? Is that an intelligence analyst? Is that a acquisitions officer? These are all kind of different ICPs. And then who's the stakeholder around that ICP? Because at the end of the day, to get any piece of software accredited on a government network, especially the Department of Defense, you have to have a contract in place. There has to be legal justification to deploy any application to a government network. And that could be a SBIR phase 1 or 2, that could be a CRADA. There are many pathways to kind of accomplish the check that you need to even begin kind of step one of the accreditation process. And then on the accreditation side, this goes back to the ICP a little bit, but who's your customer? What network are you deploying to for your use case? And what is the infrastructure that you are ultimately going to deploy onto are really critical questions that you should answer as early as possible in the deployment process. And the reason I want to use like the intelligence community and federal civilian as examples here is each of those pathways are quite different. If your ICP is the VA or IRS and you have a requirement for a FedRAMP authorization, that's a very different pathway than if your ICP is in the intelligence community and you're going to be running on classified networks probably on premise. You're not even really using cloud infrastructure potentially, depending on your deployment model. So the earlier that you can clarify those signals of where is my software eventually going to actually run for this end user in this use case, the better you can then kind of plan your deployment strategy and really start to wrap your head around what are the technical constraints and requirements to deploy to these environments. And some of those are quite similar. But we talk to, tons of startups, tons of even larger enterprise software companies that may be new entrants to this market, and they're kind of, they're bringing their commercial cloud hosted, cloud native SaaS product to the government. Government's like, great, we want that, let's buy it, but this thing is not architected in a way that's going to work on a government network, or it's using a bunch of cloud native services or third party services that are not available on a government network. So there's a bit of, what a lot of folks kind of call a gap analysis, but just understanding, hey, if I'm bringing SaaS to this market, I'm ultimately kind of deploying into a private cloud or into a self-hosted manner at some point. And what does that mean for my product roadmap today? Because that ultimately those are all going to be very, very critical pieces of the accreditation journey as you get into it with your customer.
That ideal customer profile where you deploy are some of the biggest challenges that I think companies are going to face. As you're doing some of this customer discovery, right, with the companies you all are working with, what are those big things that you're asking as they're looking at their roadmap? And what should our attendees be thinking about as they're looking at rolling out, whether they're SaaS products for the government stakeholder, or they might be on phase 2 or on StratFi? How should they be thinking about this?
So from our lens at Second Front, kind of running a platform that has a tight opinionation around design pattern and what we can support and be compatible with, we're really looking at, I'll call it kind of three things, and it's security, extensibility, and transparency. And those are kind of the critical frameworks to make the accreditation process fast and smooth for all parties involved. But security being number one of, you know, how is your product architected today, but have you run any scans against your software? Have you done SAST scanning or DAST scanning? Have you run container scans against your images? Are you using some of the best practices from Iron Bank or ChainGuard or other organizations that help you kind of be secure and be clean from day one? So we'll always take a look at security. The second is extensibility, and this goes back to the architecture piece of you're running this cloud application in commercial cloud environment, and you're using things like Sentry or SendGrid or different observability tools for day 2 operations. And you need to understand which of those tools are available on the network that you're deploying to and what the trade-off is there if they are not. So you might have to use an AWS service that's available on that network versus the third-party service that you're using today for your commercial customers. So that's the extensibility piece of, hey, as this application sits today, can it get to the place that it needs to get to? And then the last piece is transparency. This is really, really critical, I think, for any accreditation pathway. Accreditations and authorizations at the end of the day are inherently governmental activities. So all of this work and this body of evidence and the artifacts generation and the snapshots into the environment, the continuous monitoring, that is all to enable and empower an authorizing official or an ISM or a SCA or a delegated authorizing official to do their job efficiently and have all of the information they need to assess risk and either approve or not approve with a POAM an application to deploy to a network. So I think those are really the three kind of pillars to look at as you're assessing what does this deployment pathway look like for us.
Hey, that's a great overview. For some of our listeners, I'd love to dive in a little bit onto some of these terms. What is an authorizing official? Who is it? Like, who is a SCA? Why are they relevant to this
Yeah.
process?
Yeah. So an authorizing official is the designated owner of the risk of systems on a network that are connected or running on the network within their purview. Usually, this is an authorization delegated from a service CIO, and sometimes a service CISO, depending on kind of which agency. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of analogies between, I think, the contracting officer world and the authorizing official officer world, but these are the folks at the end of the day that are told, if you do this wrong or you get this wrong, like you'll go to jail. And to a certain degree, like based on, the sensitivity of data or the sensitivity of the network, those are very, very real concerns. But basically, authorizing officials are where the buck stops on government networks, and they are the folks who authorize what systems to be operating on those networks and how they operate. And then ISMs, SCAs, information system security managers, these are the folks that usually are the teams around authorizing officials that conduct the assessments. They put together POAMs for the application. So these are the things that, hey, you're authorized to deploy to the network, but over the next 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, these are the things that you have to mitigate or remediate over time in order to maintain security or compliance for this environment. So those are really the resources kind of surrounding the authorizing official, and a lot of times doing the assessment of the body of evidence, of the artifacts, of anything that might pop up that triggers a level of risk that needs to be directly assessed.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for breaking that down. Getting into some more of that meat of how do you actually speed this up? You said you guys have a very opinionated view on how to do this accreditation, security package, and all of that. And I believe you've created that in the product line called Game Warden. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this opinion is, how you are doing that, and what is Game Warden?
Yeah, yeah. So the technical opinionation is really a byproduct of the direction of kind of DevSecOps in the Department of Defense, and a lot of this was spearheaded by the Air Force with organizations like Kessel Run and Platform One. They laid the foundation of policy and technical frameworks so that applications can move quickly. Like really, a lot of the work that we've done has been built on the backs of just fantastic Americans and service members that laid this foundation. What that means for us is our platform operates under the Department of Defense DevSecOps reference architecture design, which means any application that we host has to be fully containerized and can run on Kubernetes for the orchestration. And really, that's just around a lot of the security and compliance parameters that you're able to run in a scalable fashion, not just unclassified, but across networks and across classifications. So that design pattern and opinionation on the front end is what allows applications to quickly deploy. It's really the trade-off between speed and security. The more secure you are and the tighter the design pattern is, the more quickly you can deploy through the process, and then the more quickly you can deploy with parity across classifications and networks. So that's really kind of the snapshot of what works on our platform and what works, I think, frankly, for most platforms that operate in this capacity across the department. And then what is Game Warden? So what is this platform that we operate? It's a platform as a service with an inherited security model. And what does that really mean? Most platforms as a service are really just bespoke, unique ways of combining a bunch of tools to create a better outcome for a stakeholder or customer. And we're effectively that as well. So there's two components of our product. There's a security and release pipeline on the front end that runs security scanning, hardening scripts, all of the things against the application layer that are required for an authorization. And then we have managed production runtime. And that's where we're doing day two operations, continuous monitoring, alerting, auditing, reporting, all of those things that are required from a day two operations perspective. And a very high level, that's a snapshot of the platform and how it works.
Yeah. Why did you guys choose to tackle this problem?
Yeah, I ask myself this all the time. But I think it's just such a glaring issue for the department, and the public sector writ large, that there are, I think, two fundamental realities of the future of the department, maybe really the future of warfare. The first being that everything is going to be software defined or software enabled in some sense, whether those are just cloud hosted web applications or these are weapon systems or things operating at the edge. And two, we don't have enough authorizing officials. We don't have enough ISMs. We don't have enough SCAs. So the two fundamental realities are that we need more software on the network. We need more software in places where it provides a capability, and we don't have the resources to do it with the current structure that we have today. And if you extrapolate that across the entire department or across federal civilian or across the intelligence community, this problem permeates in the entire public sector. And so I think that's very clear that there is a systemic challenge to our federal government, and a lot of it can be solved with a technical solution. And then you combine that with the fact that all of us kind of felt this pain at some point, that we can solve this. We can solve this as a community. We can solve this with not just something like Game Warden, but there should be many platforms. There should be many pathways for software to get where it needs to go so that commercial companies can actually have a path to operationalize SaaS in this environment where, I mean, you guys see this every day. If you look at the CapEx and the OpEx required to deliver to this market as a SaaS company, doesn't math with commercial SaaS. This is not a build once, sell many multi-tenant SaaS, like you're off to the races market. The margins are not as great. The overhead is tremendous. And then on the government side, we're spending taxpayer dollars that over time are diluted from the capability that gets to the end user. And so I think when you put all those on the board, it's kind of impossible to ignore this problem set. And the more time we spend on it and the more success that we see and the more adoption that we see and the faster we're seeing applications get on the network, it's really energizing. It's an amazing problem to work on.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, right? The barrier to entry right now is way too high in the traditional way of doing things. As I was inside of government and helping drive this and working with young SaaS companies, we did the cost analysis of this, and companies come to us and talk to about it all the time too. And they're like, how do we build this into our proposals? What does this look like? And if they're going off and doing it by themselves, right, it's $1 to $2 million at least to get onto a network for a customer and 12 to 18 month timeline to get that approval.
Yeah.
It's extraordinarily difficult right now. And I think you guys are truly helping shortcut a lot of that. And by building on top of the DevSecOps reference architecture, having this very opinionated view, and then being able to have that coordination and relationship with approving officials and authorizing officials to say, hey, we've built an area for all these SaaS companies to bring their products and tools to make it more and more accessible to government at large, has been a phenomenal step forward in how government can now access and engage with startups.
It's such an important point on the cost basis and barrier to entry as well that I don't think is talked about enough, or I don't think maybe there's not enough education around this, but that's the cost basis for like the first inning of the ball game. So if you are successful and you win contracts and you win awards and you're deploying to multiple networks and environments and you're running your application across Nipper or Secret or Top Secret, that operating model, I think, is way more expensive than most folks realize, where you're like, okay, now I need cleared engineers on site. I need a facilities clearance. I need DD254s. I need SREs and day two ops folks running across each of these environments and managing these environments. There's a challenge to the operating model, even in the best case scenario as well, that I don't think is talked about enough.
Yeah, I think as people are looking to break into the space, right, they need to be able to understand how can you do can you do the customer discovery? Can you do your prototype validation? Can you even do your initial scaling, right? In partners like you guys. And so how do you make that happen and how do you enable that? So I want to lean into that part a little bit, right? Like the space, there are other competitors in here. What makes Game Warden better? What makes Game Warden more unique? And I'm biased because I've seen you guys grow and work, and we're doing this webinar together, and that's because I also believe you have a bright opinion here on how to do this faster than anybody else. But I'd love for you to share why that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm obviously biased here, but I think there are many pathways for different technologies, and we are far from a one size fits all. But for what we do it very well. And I think, frankly, we've probably, as at least a commercial entity, we've been doing this longer than anyone else that's kind of taken a swing at this space. For the last couple of years, it was kind of only us operating in this capacity with the inherited security model. Although there's some folks that have been doing it successfully on the FedRAMP side, but for the Department of Defense, it was really just us for a while. I think some key differentiators are the technical design pattern. What that allows us to do is that allows us to be, I think DevSecOps is a methodology. We can effectively be the second the ops teams for our customers without being entirely opinionated on dev. So that's really important, I think, for especially for commercial software companies or startups entering the space. They don't want to change their dev cycle and how they're doing secure software development or SSDF. Those are different for every type of product and every type of team and how they operate. And with that comes, I think, like a very clear protection of intellectual property that we take very seriously, in that our customer source code is never exposed to us. It's never exposed to the government or other partners on programs, and I think that's a really important piece to call out for early entrants. Everybody's kind of heard the stories of operating as a sub with a prime, or you just have a lot of competitive nature in the space, and it's important to be very smart about how you're deploying and managing your software. And then the second major differentiation, talked about a little bit of this with the operating model, kind of long term or in the out years, but we spend all of this time talking about the ATO and the accreditation. Uh, that's great. It's super important. It has to get done. You need to get the application on the network where you can provide value to your end users, but that's just step one. An ATO is effectively worthless if your product on the network is not functioning as intended and it's not running properly, and your devs don't have a tight feedback loop between errors that are happening in production or feedback from your end user. And so I think what we pride ourselves, very strongly here on Second Front is high quality day two operations and high quality managed hosting, which in large part has not been an option on DoD networks. And so giving commercial companies that customer experience of, hey, building software for the department sucks. It always will. That's just a nature of deploying into difficult environments, but it doesn't have to be as bad as it is. And day two operations and day two managed hosting can operate in a commercial capacity and a high quality capacity. So I think those are really the two big differentiators for us in the market.
Those are great ones, right? And that is game changing, and it's I think what makes you guys stand out and be the best in the space. I have one more question before we jump into Q&A, and
Yeah.
that is, there's a lot of phase one, phase two SBIR companies. There's a lot of companies that have other transactions, CSOs. How should they think about working with you guys or addressing the software problem, really?
Yeah. So I think phase one is depending on the product, but phase one in many cases is probably a little bit early. But what you want to have at that point, and not necessarily engaging with us at that point, but you just want to know, what does the architecture need to look like? So that way, over the course of this phase one, we're not building a product for a capability that we're ultimately going to pop the hood on and then have to refactor half of it. So I think there's building secure from day one, that's important, but there's also just building architecturally compliant from day one, that's really equally as important. And I think that's the scope of the phase one world. For the phase two space, that's where I think it's really important that you have one, kind of a very tight relationship and understanding between your TPOC and your mission owners and your users, that you need to accomplish some form of accreditation during your phase two. And that sets you up for success at the end of your 18-month or 24-month prototyping R&D milestone timeline, to be accredited to be on the network and then seamlessly transition into a phase three or a StratFi or TACFi or some production contract that is the ultimate end goal of a SBIR phase two. So I think those are the biggest ones, where if you're in a phase two timeline as a pure play SaaS company, the time is now, and you need to engage both with your customer and with organizations like ourselves at Second Front, and conduct your own, build by rent kind of ROI analysis on what the deployment model looks like for your team. But in a SBIR phase two, you should be considering this early and often. And if you have the opportunity, I think when you're building your phase two milestone deliverables, you can include accreditation, you can include deployment to a network. And I think that sets you up for success in the back end.
Awesome. I 100% agree with you, right? Companies be thinking about this early and often, and it's really about understanding what your customer needs and what that deployment framework looks like. You need to have those conversations in that customer discovery phase, and then
Yes.
really nail down what that looks like and how you're building out your architecture, or what changes do you need to make to your commercial architecture to fit what the government requirements are.
Yep.
So, all right, we have some questions from our audience. So
Awesome.
go ahead and jump into them. Aaron asked a two-part question here. Are hardware companies that require SDKs to integrate into existing software solutions required to obtain an ATO for the SDK? Or do companies employing the content that integrate the hardware required to update their ATO to include the use of the SDK?
So I hate to give a consulting answer on this one, Aaron, but I think one, I'm not a deep expert in accreditation of hardware systems, but I believe it depends on what the connectivity is and what's actually running and what data is being transferred. Um, but on the back end of that, this is one of those scenarios where I kind of take all orders from the tower and defer to your customer on what exactly are the requirements for accreditation, what needs an assessment, what needs an ATO. Like I don't think it would necessarily need an ATO, but it might require an authority to connect or another authorization for it to function with the SDK or software that would be integrating with that hardware. And then for number two, we do not really support hardware ATOs today. We are tightly focused on cloud hosted or cloud native software running on operational Department of Defense networks.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer. And I want to second what you said there, TJ. I think we need to get a clear definition of what the requirements are with those government stakeholders. And we also need to pull down like into those exact requirements for that network and that use case, because I think that there's outside of the AO teams, there's actually not going to be a lot of familiarity with how that works. So you
Correct.
need to make sure you're talking to the AOs and to the right stakeholders and not just the end users on that platform, because the security requirements roll back up to the AOs. And so you want to make sure you're talking with their team to be able to roll this forward.
Yeah, very well said.
Awesome. The next question I had was related around you guys, we've talked a lot about the DoD space. We'd mentioned a little bit about the other FedCiv agencies. Can you tell me a little bit about how to think about, hey, the DoD DevSecOps reference architecture, see that for the DoD space? What should we be thinking about for FedCiv?
Yeah, for FedCiv, it's kind of all things FedRAMP, which I think is both a good and a bad thing. FedRAMP is a challenge. It's no secret that it's a massive cost undertaking, and in many ways is longer than accreditation in the Department of Defense or the IC. But I think it's trending positively overall as a program, and the inherited security model is being adopted, and there are some better pathways. But I think for the accreditation pathway, it's important to understand that it's a little bit different on what a FedRAMP authorization is for federal civilian agencies versus the Department of Defense, where for FedRAMP, they're effectively saying, here's your commercial cloud environment or your Gov cloud environment that you're running, and this is secure and compliant enough to host government data inside. Where on the Department of Defense side, they're authorizing your application and saying this is secure and compliant enough to deploy onto a government network. So they're a little bit different on the deployment model, but the requirements at the end of the day are kind of effectively the same. It's NIST 853, it is RMF, it is the same control set, and there's very close to kind of a unified baseline across the authorizations. But if you're selling to federal civilian and you're looking at FedRAMP, then it goes back to your customer, goes back to the agency. Make sure that you're having conversations about an agency sponsor early and often. There's a lot of other steps that you kind of need to line up to make sure that your FedRAMP authorization path is at least as fast or as cheap as you can make it. But it's still a long, expensive journey.
Thanks for explaining that and helping the team understand. We're getting a couple questions around how should someone think about the cost of this kind of offering, and what are the key things they should be thinking about, and what questions should they be asking you?
Yeah, I think from a cost perspective, you should be making an analysis here like you would for anything else in your business. So conduct an ROIC analysis on, hey, I need an accreditation. I need this end state. What is the cost basis to my team, both today and in the out years? And how does